Hello and welcome to the Game Studio Report 2018 Fireside Chat. I'm Will Goldstone, a product manager here at Unity, and I'm joined by an array of guests. Thank you all for being here. So, after you.
My name is Dr. Jo Twist, and I'm the Chief Exec of UK Interactive Entertainment that represents the games and interactive entertainment businesses in the UK.
My name's Peter Pimley. I'm a developer relations engineer at Unity in the console support team. I've been at Unity for about a year. Before that, I was in the games industry for about 16 years.
My name is Ciro Continisio. I'm a technical evangelist, also working from the office here in Brighton. So my role is talking to developers and showcasing Unity. And I was also a developer before. I used to run a very small studio years ago.
Cool. So, Game Studio Report, basically the reason that Unity wanted to do this was we wanted to give people a sense of a kind of a benchmark for how you run a studio, how you become successful as a studio when you're just starting out. So from this report, which you can get as a link in the description below this video, you'll be able to see all kinds of details. Now, in this fireside chat, what we wanted to do is tease out a few trends and talk about them with our esteemed guests. So there's 5 sections to this fireside chat. As I said, we're going to talk about who we surveyed, what they're making. We're going to talk about how they're working, how they promote and monetize, and how they budget. So first off, who participated in the survey? Well, we spoke to 1,445 different studios around the globe. It splits out to around 41.5% in the Americas, 48% in EMEA, and around 10% of respondents were in Asia Pacific areas. We found that the studios we spoke to were typically quite what we call young studios, so quite new, around 50%, 49% operating less than 24 months. These are studios that are all from 2 to 50. That's the aim of this study, so small to medium-sized studios. And we found that of all of those, around 58% are less than 5 people. So there's quite a big majority of very fresh emerging studios of very few staff. And that includes freelancers and contractors on top of that. And we also found that most of the people we spoke to were independent studios. So 91% doesn't belong to a larger organization. And 85% of those are developing their own IP as opposed to doing client work. We'll also hear us refer to top-ranked studios, and all we mean by that is a very kind of informal definition that says that top-ranked studio, as far as this study is concerned, is someone who has daily active users in their game and ongoing revenue supporting their business. So effectively, they have shipped a product and it's supporting them. So without further ado, let's talk about some of the trends that we saw. So the content they're making for their primary project, we found that given that we were speaking specifically to game studios, we found that 77% were creating games and 23% are creating non-game projects. So that could be anything from education, training, visualization, advertising, any of that kind of stuff. So do those kind of numbers surprise you? Do they ring true as to what you might do to support a studio?
I'm surprised at how high a percentage are working on non-game projects. It would also be interesting to know, of that amount, how many of those really want to be doing a game, but they're just doing something else to keep themselves ticking over, versus how many are really sort of into what they're doing and would quite happily continue to do so.
I think it also says a lot about the tremendous skill sets that are transferable when making games and working on games. And all the other sectors that are, other screen-based sectors, VR companies that are doing previs and then moving into VR or film industry, etc. They all are looking at immersive storytelling. That we've been doing that for 40 years. So to me, it says there's a real demand for our skill sets and the technologies that we use and the techniques that we use and the creativity that we blend with innovation. So I think it's a really interesting stat, and of course, people need money.
Yeah. Do you think that's a really interesting point? Because, the fact that you have people doing real-time rendering, do you think that that's bleeding a lot into film?
Completely. I mean, we've seen that in the past historically with all sorts of, motion capture and early techniques anyway. So real-time rendering, definitely, if you look at all the kind of interactive arts or how the film industry is going, for instance, it's definitely that sweet spot. So for me, I think it's something that we should really be proud of. But there is a practical element, which is actually, when you're making games, that is something different and unique. And a lot of companies I'm sure we'll go into this, may be finding that in order to access finance, they have to be doing other projects or using those skill sets that are taking away from actually creating a game.
So it's interesting that these companies are clearly defining themselves as game studios. But over time, do you think that that's going to blend and those companies will become, interactive studios, real-time studios, whatever it could be?
Just awesome.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. And it's clearly quite important for people to support their businesses to do that, as you'll see in some of the
I also
other
think
numbers.
many of the, sometimes the opposite process happens, like stuff that they learn in other industries, they bring it back into games. And that adds to like the game world, right? Like at Unity, like we have so many features coming around for like other industries, but in my personal opinion, they eventually will come back into games and make games richer,
Yeah, it's like
rendering quality or motion capture was mentioned, all these things that traditionally are more from film or
and I suppose as we adopt those conventions as well, like for example, hasn't been that long that the games industry has needed cinematographers.
That's true.
And things like that, or DPs.
Yeah. Roles and stuff, they come back to,
Yeah.
and everything mixes, which is interesting.
As an example of the skills going in the other direction from the games industry to elsewhere, of course, the games industry was a pioneer of VR, and now a great many other industries are starting to sort of wake up to the idea of VR, and game developers can say, yeah, we've been doing it for 3 or 4 or 5 years. We can do your data visualization project for whatever industry might require it.
But actually, an interesting point about that is that when you sit around the table with people who are interested in virtual reality and they're like amazed, a film director will go, it's incredible how we can create these really immersive environments, 3-dimensional environments, but, in a non-scripted, non-linear way. How do you direct people's attention to the narrative and the story? It's like, yeah, we've been doing that for 40 years, again.
Yeah, it is interesting that overlap with film where, like you say, you'll see like behind the scenes with directors just doing the like first time VR kind of, oh my God. Yeah, it's cool. They'll catch up though. It'll be fine. So let's talk a little more about what the independent studios are creating. So we asked people about their platforms of choice. Again, this is a multiple choice question. So this is kind of a spread of what we found. A lot of development for PC, a prevalence for mobile, less so for VR, AR, XR, but still quite a lot. If you consider the fact that, a lot of the respondents to this study were 5 people or fewer, then there's still quite a lot of people on the whole developing for XR. And console still quite a small market there. I mean, Peter, you have some experience in the console area of things.
Most of my career has been in console, yeah. Cool. I'm not terribly surprised by that figure. Some types of games are just not suited to console, so those developers won't be on console. Also, traditionally, perhaps less so now, but certainly traditionally, there has been a sort of a bar to entry with consoles. To become a licensed PlayStation or Xbox developer requires a sort of certain level of expertise and know-how that perhaps a 1 or 2 man indie studio might not have.
So you're thinking like dev kits and funding from a publisher?
Funding, and also they've just been harder to program. Unity has helped with that, of course, but yeah, it doesn't surprise me to see not so many of the respondents developing for console.
And, obviously quite a lot of mobile there. Unity, quite popular for mobile. Though we should say that the respondents to the study weren't all Unity studios. So there was a mix of people using other tech as well.
But I suppose it also speaks to cultural differences. I mean, depending on what territory that you're developing in and for. I mean, obviously we develop for global audiences, but, there's far bigger PC culture anyway in places like Germany than there is elsewhere. So those kind of place-based cultural differences are really interesting. And I know in the UK, we love our mobiles. And, if you're looking at China, it's all mobile. Well, it's PC, but it's mobile, free to play. So again, it's like, and it's also about the type of game and the ecosystem. So the ecosystem for mobile, really in 2010, really you saw that notable kind of explosion of companies. PC and what Steam has done, I guess, as an ecosystem is also interesting.
Yeah.
But that's also interesting to watch over the long term and how that evolves.
Can we clarify, was this the number of studios or the number of employees at those studios?
The studios, yeah. The number of studios that are doing PC, as a primary platform, or
so perhaps there are a great many small studios developing for mobile, and a smaller number of studios that have more employees developing for console.
It's entirely possible. I think that another kind of an obvious observation for me is that people will start out prototyping on PC typically, unless you really have a specific mobile idea that you want. If you're just dabbling, doing all kinds of things, then PC and console, it's easy to plug an Xbox pad into a PC. And
you can't do early access on mobile. You basically your early access is let's release it in New Zealand.
Yeah.
But actually, I will be very curious next year if we run this survey again to see the console number, because all of those things that we mentioned are coming to console. Like early access is coming. I've heard of very good things about Nintendo, like opening up to like the price change, right? Which is something that the developer usually wants to control. And before it was impossible.
Okay.
Now console manufacturers have opened to this idea that maybe the price can be set by the developer like more easily. And so they can run their own promotions and they can somehow make their own marketing, which before was impossible.
It is all of that ecosystem and that support around, how does that ecosystem on a particular, platform give you that contact with the community as well, which we'll get on to.
Feedback tools,
the feedback,
right? Like
exactly.
Having like a forum for your game. And
which is
Steam
so
is
important.
king in that, of course. But they're starting to come out on other platforms, I would say.
That's interesting. Yeah, I didn't know it was going that way.
It's the trend is like that, right? Like Peter, maybe you'll be able to confirm.
What
like
you
Sony
said,
and Microsoft, but also Nintendo now, they're being very receptive to the idea of giving the keys in the hands of the developer rather than controlling themselves the prices. And
I think the entire console industry has been sort of perhaps caught off guard a little bit by the App Store and the Google Play Store of the immense freedom that gives developers. Perhaps they've been caught a little bit off guard by that and are gradually catching up.
I think we mustn't forget as well that mobile really did, in particular, the business model that it did support and those ecosystems in the app stores and the deal that was done with developers. It basically opened up into completely new demographics that did exist. But if you look at, the top successes like, Candy Crush, their average audience is an early 40-year-old woman. So, mobile in particular, if you're looking at new audiences or audiences you haven't yet reached, there are definite, I think, demographics that suit particular environments, dare I say. And I speak personally as a game player. I prefer playing on mobile or my console or in VR. Less so on PC, just because of the practicalities and
it feels like work.
Sorry?
It feels like work to me when I play on my PC.
A little bit. But I think that's an important point about, the demographics of the types of audiences that your particular kind of game or who you want to reach.
Yeah.
That's sort of, I think that shines through really.
Cool. So the next thing we asked these studios was how long they've been operating for. So around half of the people we spoke to are operating less than 24 months. So that suggests a certain amount of growth in the industry. I mean, does that ring true for you as well? Or?
Yeah, I was surprised that actually it's that high in the last 2 years. I think, again, we saw over the last 5 years there's been tremendous growth in startups, particularly in the UK, because of incentives that we have at a government level, to be honest, because we're now competing with Canada with their incentives. But I think also, I wonder if there's a trend. I certainly see this anecdotally, particularly in the UK. We're a 40-year industry, 40-something year, and a lot of veterans, if you like, are coming out of larger studios and wanting to set up their own studios, and that kind of sort of rebirthing. Or phoenixing is quite interesting.
Phoenixing,
so I wonder if
it's
so you've got people who've been in the industry for 20 or 30 years, but worked in large studios or a large publisher, and then are wanting to do things on their own terms. I certainly anecdotally come across a lot of people like that.
Yeah, even in Brighton, where I've spent most of my career, 10 years ago, there are essentially 3 games companies in Brighton, each of which employed a little bit over 100 people. And now it's the other extreme. There's probably about 100 games companies, each of which on average has 2 or 3.
Right.
Yeah. And that's a really good sign. But the challenge there is, how do you support that growth and that scale, the scaling up? And a lot of it is to do with people wanting a different kind of quality of life and a different kind of way of working, which I think is an important trend.
And so how do you, given that amount of time to make like your first project, how do you see people supporting themselves when they're looking to? So if you were talking to someone who's at these larger studios and they're thinking, I really want to go and do it, but can I? Anecdotally, what have you heard people tend to do? Is it a lot of freelance or
people using their redundancy pay?
Yeah, I was going to say that as well.
I think we get into that with another stat, right?
Yeah, we do. We have more on that later.
Interesting stats on that.
So what you're saying is get made redundant?
That has happened. Other times it's been sort of a labour of love in the evenings and weekends. That's the sort of fairy tale scenario. Do your day job and then work on your little hobby project at home, and it's good enough to get funding. I don't know how often that happens, but
I think there are more routes to financing. Again, that's different territory to territory, so it's important to kind of recognise that. And I think certainly in the UK, the tax relief system, the video games tax relief, has opened up other routes to financing, has de-risked a lot of endeavours, and enable people to kind of take a punt, but it is still very risky to do that. You know,
that's something that we miss in Italy.
Yeah, there you go. I know. Italy wants it. Germany wants it. You know.
Yeah, because traditionally in Italy, when you ask for financing for funds, to a bank or something, they wouldn't invest in you because what is this thing, games?
That still happens. Yeah,
it's more on tourism and agriculture and stuff. Not anymore, but it used to be, and that's why it lost some ground internationally.
Yeah.
Okay. So obviously we know that the first project that you'll come up with requires a big investment in time. So some of the people that we spoke to expressed that they were taking, in the bracket of between 2 and 5 size studio, they were taking, up to sort of 18 months to produce their first thing. So we're assuming that a lot of those people are developing it in their spare time and trying to get to that first idea that seems financially viable or maybe viable for early access, do you think?
The painful truth is that they're probably making more mistakes. Making your second game
as they go, right?
Yeah, it's way more easy to make your second game than your first one because on your second one you know what to avoid doing. You know all the mistakes not to make.
Right.
And you might still make them.
But the advice here, generally speaking, is to get your first game under your belt to go through the process and understand the process a bit better, I suppose.
The advice from me, at least, would be to get your first game out as fast as possible, to make a smaller project as possible, because that project is still going to be bigger than what you expect, right? So if you're aiming for a year, it's probably going to be 1 year and a half, and so if you scale down, then you have more chances to make it if you aim for 3 months project rather than if it's your first one.
And you still gain the appreciation of the whole
of the whole process, right?
Yeah.
From pre-production to production, but then also to marketing and all the things that come after that, right? And maintaining as well.
It's also, I guess, it takes time to find the right team and to find that right team mix, because we mustn't forget that we're a high-tech industry and we're a really highly creative industry. So that attracts, different types of people. And I think some of the issues that lots of game studios have come to us about have been those challenges of recruiting the right people or finding the people, because we're all in competition, and actually our programming talent, we're in competition with whatever's next cryptocurrency that's coming out. And,
Fair enough.
So I think it's interesting, because whether that's time once you found the team or whether that's actually time in getting the right mix of team and the right people on the right project.
Okay, well, speaking of the experience of making your first game analytics. We asked about studios as to whether they used analytics. And these two numbers seem to me kind of low, but also kind of expected. So 36% of all studios we found use analytics in their games. So they analyze all manner of aspects of the gameplay, how people are, the player behavior and things like that. But of our top ranked studios, so remember the ones that are using income from their games, still only 50% using analytics. Does that surprise anybody else? Or
the fact that the percentage is higher in the top ranked studios, I think that's a clear sign.
Yeah.
Analytics is good. The 64% of studios that are not using analytics, effectively they're choosing not to know all of that information.
Right.
There are a few reasons not to use analytics.
It depends on your business model, right? So if you're a free to play mobile game or game on any platform, free to play, and you're constantly challenging your events team to come up with different events within a free to play game, you have to have data analysts and people who are translating that day-to-day, hour-to-hour analytics coming in.
That's a good point. You might have the numbers, but then who interprets them?
Exactly. So, but if you're doing a premium title that is a game experience that's 4 hours long and that's it, you need a certain amount of analytics to understand, did this work? And what can we do better next time? But you're not servicing that game with new content. So, and to service that game with new content requires a whole infrastructure that you need to be able to have funding to be able to do. So the smaller studios are not going to be able to necessarily afford that.
So it probably actually rings true as well with this scale of studio that we were talking about. You think about like between 2 and 5 people, one of those is probably not a data analyst. It's probably a couple of programmers, artists, animator, producer, whatever.
Data is hard to interpret. It's easy to gather. There's so many solutions now, but making sense of it is like, okay, what is the data actually telling us? Or even like which data to gather, right? Like where to put your events in your code and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, like, not to get into too much of a sales pitch, but our Unity Analytics team does a lot of stuff to make tools for this reason. So I think we're kind of acknowledging that this is something that people need help with as well.
But it's surprising because I think we chatted about this yesterday. You can use analytics also before the launch, before the thing goes online. You can use them for even internally. Like if you're running a lot of tests on the game, you could gather analytics on people in the team playing the game. They could be used throughout the lifetime of the product, and that's why it was surprising that it's this low, because potentially any game studio could just put a few events into the code and track how the difficulty is progressing.
I suppose I wonder if there's just an older school way of doing it, which is you do playtesting and you're just doing it with humans in the room.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can use both, right?
Yeah,
you can use human supervision plus the power of the numbers. And
I worked on a project where we used an analytics system during development. We switched it off for production, but just during development it was useful. And because we weren't going all the way to production with it, we could be quite sort of carefree about what we gathered. It was very quick to implement, and it was a worthwhile process. It just sort of saved more time than it used up.
Out of curiosity, what kind of events were you tracking?
So it was a racing-based game, so we tracked lap times. We also tracked which tracks people chose, to find out which one's the most popular, and then we could start to think, well, why is it popular? Why is this one being played twice as many times as that one? What's your favourite car? Why is that?
So that's cool. Yeah.
So you could save time on not spending time on a particular level that people don't really care for, or fix it.
Fix it was the sort of was what we tried to do.
Yeah.
But just knowing.
Knowing.
Then you can make a decision. It might even be the wrong decision, but at least you know you've got some sort of concrete numbers to base your decision from.
Cool.
Makes sense.
So moving on to how our respondents work, we asked them how they spend time on their projects. So one of the trends that we noticed here was that as studios mature, going from their first production to second, third, etc., they spend a lot less time on prototyping projects. Now, this seems like a fairly expected observation, but I was just curious to ask as to why we thought that was. Do we think that this is that studios typically stay in a lane, like they find a genre or the type of game that they've prototyped and then do more of it if it's successful? Or do we think that people are just kind of honing their craft and carrying it on?
Either, both.
Yeah. It's difficult because it's obviously less risky if you have had a tried and tested model. But I wonder if there's, I know some of the more successful, smaller studios do kind of informal prototyping through game jams within the team because it's always really kind of helpful. But then on the flip side, I wonder how much of this, as studios mature, is about the reliance on data analytics, actually, instead of prototyping. I don't know. It's a question. So it's quite a complex finding that probably needs unpicking a bit.
Yeah, well, we can obviously look at the full report for more of this kind of data, but I think that's definitely something that we'll do in future. So basically, something we didn't mention is that we're going to keep doing this report every year, and so we'll see a change in the trends, and obviously we can build in additional things that people are curious about. So when you look at the report, if you have any feedback for us, do let us know and say, okay, well, that's an interesting thing, but you didn't ask this thing, and for next time we can ask some of that additional stuff. So in terms of working as well, how they work, we asked about people's workspace situation, and we found that overall 45% of people actually work remotely, and 62% of studios, 5 or less, so 2 to 5 employees, were working remotely, and that included freelancers and contractors. So there's a lot of people actually working in a completely distributed manner. Does that make sense? I mean, so to kind of add on to that, 61% of the studios that we spoke to who've been around over 2 years had found their own space, and that seems fairly consistent with some of the people that I know as well.
I mean, again, this can be very specific depending on which territory you're actually operating from, because certainly in the UK, you where the talent is sometimes is not necessarily where you should set up necessarily. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And we know successful companies that come in maybe once a month to our offices, which is co-working space, and they then all disperse remotely. And as long as you get that contact, I think that's fine. Mm-hmm. And a lot of it is a quality of life thing again. If rent and workspaces are too expensive in a particular city and you want to hire the best talent and the best freelancers and the best contractors, you can't necessarily expect them to uproot families or, completely change their way of life, but you still want them to work with you. And now with all the digital tools and channels that we have, like Slack and Discord and so on, it makes it so much easier to work remotely. But I think it's still important that humans have that human contact, right?
Actually, this happens for us as well at Unity, because Unity has 23 offices.
At least, yeah.
But then so many people work in teams that are spread around the world. Like I have Evangelist in the US that I work with. Will works with
I'm part of a team that's based in every office.
And so Unity spends a lot of effort into bringing these people together every now and then to get back that human connection, which, as you say, is like you can't substitute that.
Yeah.
So we have recurring gatherings around the world.
But I find it interesting, like Brighton's a classic case in point. So many people, again, this is partly mirroring the maturity of the industry and our life cycle as people in the industry, where you want a bigger space to live in, maybe, or so you move away from a really big city like London and you want to be by the ocean and you want different kinds of schools, or you just, you have a family. I think all of these human factors kind of do change the way that we work, but so do other kind of economic factors and other kind of hard realities of studio culture. But, for me, Brighton has become this kind of amazing space where you have now a huge cluster of companies. Yeah. And, you can start small with a few companies there, but it's like a magnet.
Yeah, I mean, it drew Unity UK to here.
Exactly.
We never opened a huge London office. We've got a few people who work there, but, this is our base.
Yeah.
But it is like, on the kind of flip side of all of this, it's still quite reassuring to know that if you hook up with a friend who's the other side of the globe, you can still work with them. You can, like you say, you can use Discord and you can spin up a GitLab project and, just...
I'm not sure hookup's the appropriate term to use anymore.
Not with Discord,
apparently.
Maybe. We'll cut that. Oh, we're live. Okay. Moving swiftly on from Workspace. So we also asked people about key roles in the studio, and this was a kind of breakdown. And I think this kind of makes sense as an overall breakdown, especially considering a lot of the studios we spoke to were small, in that 2 to 5 and 10 or less bracket. But it's interesting to me, like the amount of people who said they were doing QA, for example, and community management as well, which is something we'll come back to in a little while. But generally speaking, does that ring true for everybody else?
It'd be interesting to see these numbers split by how large the studio is. So, for example, I
think we have it in the next
oh, really? Okay.
slide. Yeah.
I was going to say, in a 2-person studio...
Yeah.
Here we go. In a 2-person studio, one of those people is going to be a programmer.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you won't have a
There's
game.
no game, yes.
Whereas in a 10-person studio, maybe you'll have 3 programmers. So it's gone from 1/2 to 1/3.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
But also as well, this whole games ecosystem that we have, where then you've got separate QA companies, you've got separate companies that are all kind of feeding this economy and kind of community and ecosystem. They play a role, therefore, because you might want to outsource that because you don't necessarily want that overhead in your studio. So it just, I think, reflects quite a flexible ecosystem that is growing up.
Yeah, and I think, you're right. It reflects the idea that, you might need QA, but you might not need it all the time.
Yeah.
So outsourcing those, you probably shouldn't call them niche requirements, but they're a specific time in the production and things like that. So the stats that we have in front of us here, studios between 2 and 5 had 30% less QA and 10% more programmers. So it's pretty much exactly as predicted. And regionally speaking, we found that 20% more interest in filling programmer roles in Asia Pacific compared to America and EMEA, so Europe, Middle East, Africa. And then 50% less interest in filling QA roles in EMEA compared to studios in America, who also had a lot more interest in production. So there's a lot more QA in production as you scale up in the Americas. And where do we find talent? So this is quite an interesting one. We found that studios sort of less than 10 tend to rely on their own network, social media, and industry events. And then as you get kind of beyond 10 people, a lot of people will then use what in industry we'd consider more traditional ways of finding talent. So using industry events, but then also job portals and recruitment agencies as well. And usage of recruitment more than doubles as your studio grows beyond 10 people. So one of the questions that I had about this was, do you feel like for the studios that are 10 people or less, that they tend to kind of hire within their own bubble because they're relying on their own network? And, to me, that was a question kind of about diversity as well. Do you think that leads to the diversity issue that we have in the industry?
I think it's a really delicate one because I think it may do. But there are examples of really small studios who recognise that and recognise actually that they need a diversity of perspective and experience as well as skills. So we'll go to industry events that aren't necessarily games industry events. So they might be other types of industry events where you're going to find that same level of skill set might just need a little bit of honing. But I think it is just important to be mindful of that. You've got a self-selecting pool of people at an industry event. You've got a self-selecting pool of people in your own network and your social media channels. It also requires a little bit of confidence to be kind of shouting out on social media, oh, hey, I'm going to go for this job, or, oh, I want to talk to you, which not everyone has. So I think it is important to kind of realize that it is a difficult, delicate one. And just there is best practice routes for understanding how you do sort of get out of that self-selecting bubble while still getting the best person that you can get. But also understanding that, even when you do use an agency, you've got to make sure that you're saying to the agency, please make double the effort to go out and recruit from a diverse pool. We do have a skill shortage in this country in terms of programmers, and particularly, diversity is an issue in this industry in this country, as it is globally. But there are things you can do. But I know that people you need to get the game done, and you need to have the skilled person to do it. So it's a delicate one. It's a difficult one.
It's a really interesting point you made there about the idea that people don't necessarily aren't, the level of a talent or job appropriate skill set isn't necessarily commensurate with how communicative or shouty they are about or confident in conveying their ability to do a job. So it's interesting to maybe consider, if you're looking for talent, to think about how, more innovative ways you can go about finding those people.
There's lots of best practice even about how you construct a job ad, or how, even if you're just advertising it on your own website and tweeting it out, but how you word it, how you make it more inclusive, how you do the whole interviewing or, programmer tests, all of that kind of thing. That there's a lot of different aspects to diversity, and actually you want to get the best person you can, but it is just a little bit more effort.
Cool. So promoting and monetizing their projects, we asked people about basically how they make money from their work. We found that in promoting their game, only 39% of people manage a community versus 62% within our top ranked studios. This is something that I think is really important, and I don't know how well smaller studios deal with this. Partially because, like the QA, they don't necessarily have a dedicated person, but also I think that people could do a lot to kind of recognize the value of getting people invested in their project early. How do you feel about that? Like, is that something that you've experienced, Peter, in your line of work? Like, would you have cultivated a community around a project early, or?
It's difficult to know. It's one of those things that is always on the back of your mind, thinking, yeah, we really should do that, but I'm fighting this fire at the moment. I need to do something else. And then you probably look back and regret it when you launch, and you think, oh, I really should have done more sort of investing in a community and doing some promotion before launch. And a sort of a classic mistake that maybe a lot of very small indies do is they make their game, they release it on the store, and they expect it to perform as well as the game is. And you can have a really good game, but it could just disappear without a trace if it doesn't have sort of a community investment and sort of people promoting it to each other.
Like a critical mass of...
Critical mass, that's the term I was looking for. Yeah.
I think, I can draw on quite a lot of previous experiences in other sectors and in games when I was commissioning games at Channel 4. But, what we did was always just having a very open, transparent, creative process. So development blogs, and just doing early concept artwork. I remember a BBC Three TV series we worked on called Being Human, which was about a werewolf, a vampire, and I can't remember the third one, zombie probably, living together in a house in Wales or somewhere. But, we had some early like concept art for the when you transmogrify. And that just got people excited, and giving access to the artist or giving access to the writer, and doing AMAs on blogs in the old days, that kind of thing is actually quite a simple step to make. Because I think the trap that you can fall into is that the community manages you.
Right, yeah.
Rather than the other way around. And it can get a bit overwhelming. And, again, it's a creative process. And there's this correct balance between kind of co-developing with a community and listening, but also not letting that manage the whole development process.
Yeah.
Yeah, with any sort of creative industry, TV included, you sometimes get the feeling that a product is being designed for a sort of ever-decreasing number of very shouty people on some internet forum somewhere.
We don't have that problem at Unity.
So
make it all cats.
Certainly it's a... Yeah,
get rid of the vampire.
Oh, it's a ghost. Sorry, not a zombie.
There you go.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, there are... it's a two-edged sword. You have to sort of keep these things in perspective, I suppose.
But I think, again, it's about the ecosystem that makes it easy as well. So, again, Steam Store or the Steam platform as a platform, or
it's a ready-made community,
exactly,
ready to consume things.
Exactly,
Yep.
but a particular type of community, perhaps.
So, like, just to kind of as a takeaway, like I still think that that, like, to your point, Peter, like managing a community, like building up a critical mass of people is important. So in terms of building that community, there's a lot of great talks on YouTube. That I'm thinking of one by Emmy Johansson. I think it's on our Learn website, but you can look that up. It's just called Marketing for Indie Developers. But in it, she talks about all of these kind of simple techniques. A lot of what you've talked about, dev blogging, doing
Discord.
AMAs, making a Discord channel.
Is like the latest trend, if you want.
Yeah, Discord's a great way of just connecting and building a community, because you're effectively making a small bubble of forums, but it's all live and you can just do things whenever you want.
It's such a powerful mechanism because they are your Pied Pipers, they are your ambassadors. They can be the harshest critics, but it gives it that authenticity. But it also means in doing it also in different media, so not just written. You can do videos, you can do podcasts, you can do all sorts of different. You can have little mini competitions with artwork. You can give away artwork. You can do it face to face at events. It is incredibly important, but I think people see it as a thing that you create rather than curate. It's like in the early days when people used to come to you and they'd say, I'm going to make you a viral video. So no, you're not. You're going to make a video and it may go viral.
Maybe it will.
So you can't just create a community. You need to kind of be listening and understanding, curating and be part of it.
So it's about finding where the people are and behaving in a way that attracts them to your product.
Yeah, you're going to have people. You're obviously making a game that's marketed or aimed at a particular kind of audience. So find where that audience hangs out online and in other fora as well, and face to face, physically, events, whatever. And that it's a hard job. And the bigger studios and the top ranked studios have the resources to do that, and they also have the IP that's probably already established that people want to come back to. So.
And you'll find a lot as well, it kind of fills other functions. It's kind of, for a smaller studio, it's it's kind of filling the kind of things like mock reviews and stuff like that. It's about getting feedback as much as it is about having players ready when you do release, I suppose.
The very first step you said there was know your audience and go and meet them. But the start of that sentence was know your audience. That's the key thing.
So, I mean, like, you can look at all kinds of examples of that. I mean, Twitch is huge for shooters and for other kind of games, because there's an audience already there to watch the people they like commenting on games. So it's just about finding the right utilizing people like influencers and streamers to try and say, okay, well, my type of game is quite like what this person plays, and their community they have a big following, and maybe I can tap into that, and actually these people would be valuable. Instead of just saying I'm going to market to these people, the feedback from these people is really valuable to me.
It's hard sometimes. There was a moment where YouTube streamers were hugely popular, right? And then every game was thinking that YouTube was the way to go to do this kind of like free marketing. And then some people found out that sometimes that was not the place that they should have done marketing. Like, narrative games, they're not perfect for YouTube streaming because you spoil the game. So there has been a learning, I think, in the global consciousness of, especially of indie developers, in that even if YouTube is hugely popular now, and then it was Twitch, and then now it's, there's Discord around. I mean, YouTube is still there, but like there's these peaks of interest that indies sometimes show for a specific channel, but it's not good for all of them. It's not good for everyone.
But there's so many different types of community out there that will be interested in a theme of your game, even if your game is doing something quite innovative, different. So you look at like games that are tackling quite serious issues, like mental health issues and so on, and actually there'll be fora, there'll be communities online already, and sort of starting a relationship with them rather than thinking of it as a marketing strategy. It's going to stand out because that's a community that possibly hasn't really been engaged with
that media before.
Exactly. And you'll find that it's like, oh, we're hungry for this, and they will point out how you can remain authentic in your game or whatever it is. But if it's just a nice, fun kind of shooting game, then...
But I see that quite a bit with kind of revivals of genres as well. I find that, when someone comes along and they find like, a community of people who are interested in type of game X, but that type of game hasn't had a hit for a while. It's like when adventure games kind of came back a bit with Double Fine doing Broken Age, and you found that there's now a swell of adventure
it's
games.
Like a dormant.
Yes,
yeah,
exactly.
it's just kind of waiting, and then the audience has always been there, but no one
Just
really
needs
knew
activated.
how to kind of phoenix them, as you would say. Yeah,
it's interesting to avoid falling into the trap of sort of partitioning people into the wrong genre. I'm just thinking of an anecdote. I know some friends that have made a game of charades that you play on Twitch. Okay. So they're thinking, okay, what do people on Twitch like? They like first-person shooters, don't they? In actual fact, that wasn't the case. People on Twitch like doing stuff on Twitch. And this charades game became really popular with people on Twitch just because it's a Twitch thing.
Yeah.
right.
Even though it wasn't the sort of latest bro shooter. And if you thought people on Twitch like shooters, you've partitioned a group of people the sort of the wrong way.
Right.
I don't really know how to avoid falling into that trap, but it's something to sort of keep in mind.
So you're basically taking a step back from the medium and considering what people are actually doing with it, as opposed to just
I suppose
specifics.
If you're putting a lot of people into a bucket, you might be putting them into the wrong bucket, or you might have sort of arranged your buckets incorrectly.
Yeah.
I think the key for me has always been that people never really change that much in terms of their motivations. When we talk about people spending a lot of time online or behind the screen, it's actually because a lot of time as humans, we crave that social connection. We crave that sharing and that kind of celebrating and that kind of geeking out over particular things, and as social objects, and that's around which we gather. So it's like always remembering that actually humans are motivated by shared experiences and celebration, so if you're all part of that Twitch community or sets of communities, you want to do things together, whether it's a first-person shooter or charades.
Yeah. Have you just given away their idea by...
no, it's released already.
First-person charades.
First-person charades.
Yes!
Okay, so moving on from this, we talked to everybody about monetizing games. So how do people make money from video games? Well, we found that 53% of people will monetize via a premium model, so one-off sale. And that includes things that would then be supplemented with DLC. And 36% of people used freemium approach with in-app purchases. And 28% used freemium with ads. So it's likely that, some of the freemium with ads is likely to be mobile. But then 21% of people monetized via client work. So, for example, with VR, we found that 56% of people doing VR actually chose client work rather than developing their own IP, which suggests that there's probably quite a lot of people, commissioning game studios to do VR projects, much like there was a few years ago with make me a viral video, make me an app.
I mean, the percentage going from 21 to 56 for VR alone is a substantial growth. So it's interesting.
And it's interesting because I reckon that is about, we need to be able to cut our teeth and experiment and throw stuff against the wall in VR at the moment, see what sticks. And actually, it's better to de-risk that by getting someone else to pay for it. And you can make it, because it's bound to, I wonder how much of that client work in VR is actually game stuff or other types of, we want you to make a 360 VR experience of this, whatever it is. Yeah. And so that's like honing your team skill set and sort of learning as you're doing stuff, but it is less risky in order to then develop the own IP.
I don't think there's anything to be sort of ashamed of either in sort of de-risking your project by doing that. It's just like traditional games publishers. They are in the business of doing a bit of spread betting. And I would imagine most game developers are not in the business of doing that sort of spread betting. They're in the business of developing games. So letting each person do the job that they're best at, I don't think that's anything to be sort of frowned upon that.
This goes together with the stat that we saw before, I think. The fact that as Studio Grow, the top-ranked one, they have like 3 or more projects active at a time.
Yeah.
And that's like to distribute the risk, right?
Yeah.
It's like 2 of them are going to fail somehow or just stay afloat. But then one of them might be successful, and that's the one that keeps the other 2 running. And
yeah, I talked to a studio at GDC a couple of months ago, and they were showing me, their 5 prototypes that they had going, equally polished, all of them. Not like they had one great and a few other ideas. They were all equally fleshed out, and I wanted to play all of them. But they had to do a Sophie's Choice and pick one of their babies. Probably not the best analogy.
I mean, that gives you a lot of flexibility when you're speaking with a publisher, right? Because getting an appointment with the publisher is not easy. So once you're there, why not show them
what you can do,
more stuff, and then maybe one of them is going to be.
Well, this is what they were doing. The reason that I was speaking to them was they had a whole bunch of people coming and visiting them. They're showing them all of their ideas and getting all the feedback from a bunch of different people. I'm not from a publisher, but they had mostly publishers coming to visit them and saying, "Oh, we like that idea the most," and that's really valuable to them.
But also that premium model stats, I mean, that's not a surprise because, again, that depends on your genre of game. It depends on whether you're willing to invest in producing more content in order to feed the IAP feeding frenzy, and that's a big undertaking. Whereas if you are just saying, and also there is an awareness issue of, again, depending on the type of game, a lot of games are obviously 3+, they're suitable for everyone, particularly on mobile. And you've got a lot of parents or carers who you want just one-time purchase and that's it. And, then...
That's a very good point.
Someone
IAP can't exist in that world.
Exactly. Well, I think it can, but it's just more, it's
not the same
difficult.
kind of loop, right? It's like, maybe they look more like DLCs than... purchases as we know them.
And looking at games as an art form as well, a few years ago it felt like IAP was the only way people were ever going to make games again, and the premium model that's given me some of my favourite games was all over. All games are going to be in-app purchasing now. It's reassuring to me that there's a pretty healthy mix of different types there. No one model has dominated at the expense of all others.
I don't think it can. I think that, if you think about things like the freemium model, certainly on mobile, they feel like a subscription, to some extent. And I think, like you mentioned, for parents and caregivers, they are looking at someone who has access to, their credit card, and they are subscribing.
Although they should always put on the parental controls and not give them access to the credit card.
Yes, that's good advice for parents out there who are definitely watching this video. But I just mean in the sense that, we consume other media in that kind of subscription way at the moment. So it's kind of an open question. Do you think at some point we will end up in a way that is more of a Netflix or a Spotify model for games? I know people have tried it with things like OnLive. Do you think that's ever going to take hold in our industry?
If you take books as an analogy, people buy books and they buy magazines. A book is more like a premium game. It's a higher purchase cost, but you have the whole thing in your hands. Whereas subscribing to a magazine, it's a steady trickle, and both of those business models work for books. Perhaps they will for games as well.
I think it's always going to be a mixed economy, and I think that's what's so great about being in this industry. As long as you're doing this in a responsible way and you're staying within consumer protection laws, quite rightly, there is so much room for innovation in different business models. And it is just about being able to understand, again, who are you targeting with your game? Who do you want to play? Is that a barrier if there's ads? Is it a barrier if there's in-app purchases? Is it a barrier if it's premium? So it's thinking about that whole kind of, understanding of your game and what you want to go out and achieve with it, and do you have the team to be able to keep satisfying that hungry monster?
Yeah, I suppose there's something to be said for the idea of going to something that uses in-app purchases as, do I have the infrastructure to do this? Have I designed a game that has a loop that this actually makes sense to do, or am I just adding stuff on top that I think people will want to consume. So I suppose a lot of this, when you're deciding, as some of the people who'll be watching this video, how to go about monetizing, that really needs to come at a kind of a design phase as well, right? When you're thinking about what your idea is, consider, am I going to want to support this game, or am I just telling a story? Am I, so like you say, it very much depends on the genre of the game as well. So, budgeting, final section, how people actually planned to, support themselves, be able to make a game. So we asked people how they actually go about this, and we found that a significant portion of budgets come from self-funding and freelancing. So when we say self-funding, we mean coming from existing funds you had. So this is not necessarily, supporting it with a previous game that you had. So a lot of people are drawing money from savings, and we mentioned, unfortunately, redundancy earlier. But then there's a prevalence of revenue from freelancing, and then it kind of scales down where it comes from like investment, grants. Revenue from existing titles was actually quite low, only about 14%. And then there's things like public funding. And interestingly, crowdfunding was the lowest that we found, around about 3% of what was providing people's budgets. How does this make sense to you guys?
I mean, for me, I'd be interested to see the specific country breakdown again, because, public funding or grants, if you look at that figure, and I know there would have been quite a lot from Canada who might have mentioned, various Canadian specific grants, public funding grants, and they're far more ahead of the game than the rest of the world. And I think it just shows, I'm not saying games should rely on public funding or grants, but I think there's a real cultural statement that can be made. And, I worked for BBC for years, and that was money that comes from the public in the form of a license fee to be able to see the kind of content that otherwise you wouldn't ever see. And out of that has grown incredible.
I agree.
Absolutely fundamental. And I think
it's like the stuff that wouldn't be made.
Exactly.
Because nobody would bet on that.
Precisely.
Except a government body, right?
And that, I think, is very important for our future as an industry in terms of diversity of content, the sophistication of stories that we want to tell. This, it's really important that we have that. But I also think it's disappointing to see that still the top source is self-funding.
Yeah, it's scary how high that number is. But I wonder what the priorities are of the different studios. Some people might be doing it purely as a labour of love, and if they developed a game for a year or so, fail to make a profit, and those people sort of go back into regular employment elsewhere, do they view that as a success or a failure? If they were sort of going in it sort of with that as a known danger, then okay, maybe do it with your own money, but it's a risky game.
And I think it's interesting that sort of private funding from investors or grants is okay, but it's still pretty low. And again, that speaks to the traditional kind of lack of understanding that started with banks, not understanding intangible IP creation. And what do you mean you don't have bricks and mortar office that we can then sell off if you default on your loan and we can get our money back? That kind of thing.
So you're telling me that the UK did the same thing?
Yeah,
basically.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
But I think that there's still a big education job in terms of what investor funding looks like. And again, there's all sorts of other kind of initiatives which in various countries, things like tax relief can provide routes to more loans, because in this country, even if your game is cancelled or failed or not released, you can still get that money back on your development costs. So that gives some sense of security in terms of investors when they're learning. There's also quite a lot of kind of education that needs to be done with angel investors. Not a lot of companies want to necessarily give away equity to investors. So it's a really complex kind of territory, and it's still not there yet, really. Crowdfunding, I'm not surprised at, actually, because, that is more tricky.
Do you think that some of this has come about because we've moved from a very publisher-driven model to quite a prevalence of self-publishing, but there not being that kind of maturity in the how to get investment area in the middle of that that's still required when you self-publish.
Yeah.
It could be. If we had this graph maybe 10 or 15 years ago, self-funded would probably be zero, because to make a game back then cost £1 million. Whereas now, you could do it with sort of, if you've got enough savings to keep yourself going for a year, you could make a punt on the games industry. So in a way, it's encouraging that it's even possible now. But
I think, as you said before, there's one thing to say, like, success is not necessarily like making millions.
Yeah.
As you say, there's some people that just do it for the passion.
But there's also a sliding scale, right? There's a sliding scale of success being like, what did I learn from this first game production?
So much factors to it.
And then the next one, and then the next one, and building that up.
Of course, I don't want to say, like, of course you want to build sustainability, if that's the thing that you want to keep doing, right?
And also, let's not forget, these are young companies. So things like revenue from existing titles, you would hope, sort of increases over time when you do this piece of work over the next few years, because then you'll see that that's actually working, and then that's kind of feeding the engine, and people are having to rely less on public grants, but that's now being directed to other new studios. So it kind of, this whole kind of cycle hopefully will get healthier and more, I guess, scalable. And the education from investors is only going to go up, hopefully.
Yeah, you'd hope so, yeah.
You'd hope so. And therefore then the self-funding might decrease and people can actually keep their homes.
Yeah, that would be
lovely. Nice.
So you made a point earlier about crowdfunding. How do you think that's kind of evolved over the past few years?
I would love to see crowdfunding make a comeback, to be honest, because I think it was bigger in the past, especially for games.
I think it's still big. It's just smaller in terms of
comparison
more targeted,
to the rest. I think there has been a few crowdfunding campaigns that kind of like burned the audience. And so now the smaller ones, which probably are the subject of this survey, have a harder time convincing.
That often happens with a new idea, doesn't it? It starts out, it's new, and all of a sudden it's the future, and everything's going to be done like that. And then there are some sort of high-profile times when people get their fingers burned, and suddenly it contracts, and then nobody's ever going to do it again.
Boom.
And then it sort of all steadies out, and maybe over the course of the next few years it will just sort of steady a bit.
But it's still there. But the problem is, again, with this piece of research, not problem with the research, problem with the people that you're asking is that crowdfunding for new studios or young studios, unless you've got a nostalgia IP that people want to see bring back. I mean, the whole Atari crowdfunding campaign from a couple of days ago that broke the internet. I mean, it's completely bonkers. So I think crowdfunding, for me, it seems to be, it's definitely hit its niche in terms of, or its sweet spot in terms of nostalgia-driven things, or really weird tech over here that no one's seen and wants.
Unfortunately, yes, because that's, I think, the dilemma, the thing with crowdfunding. You will think that you put a project there that's innovative and people fund it, and it's quite the opposite. It's like if it's too innovative, then people will not quite understand what it is. So you always need to like hook back onto something that's more understandable, like a game genre or an IP.
It depends whether it's kind of like the community conversation we had earlier. Yeah. It's like, can you attract the right people to that pitch? Because ultimately it's a pitch, and you're just putting it on a YouTube with a community attached to it. I don't know necessarily that there are,
No, what I'm saying is that, for example, you go on a crowdfunding platform, you pitch a game, and what's the first thing you say about the game? This is a shooter. This is so you need to like at least like frame it into a genre. If you can't do that, then maybe crowdfunding is not for you, because people are not gonna understand what you're talking about, and then maybe it makes more sense to pitch it to like as she was saying, like different bodies that can believe in your idea even if they don't see something commercial straight away. That's what I'm saying. It's like there's a difficulty in there for like small studios to pitch their very innovative idea without framing it into something that's very concrete and recognizable.
But I think with
crowdfunding, you're pitching to somebody who isn't sort of in the business of being pitched to. So you've got to make it very, very easy. A classic sort of crowdfunded pitch is, we're making this 80s game on modern hardware. Elite Dangerous.
Yeah.
We're making Elite again. Yeah, perfect. I can understand that.
Remember Elite.
As a consumer, I can go, yes, that's a good idea.
Yeah.
Take my money.
Yeah.
Whereas if
It's almost always like this. There's always some factor that screams back at the past IP or retro gaming or...
So you're talking about anchoring it in familiarity somehow.
Yes, I think so.
Yeah. But to your point you made earlier, like the idea of like being concrete about what your idea is when you're doing a crowdfunding campaign, I think you've probably got a bigger problem on your hands if you can't sum that up in 30 seconds anyway.
I know. That's common practice, right? Like, common good practice to have kind of like the elevator pitch, and that's valid for everything. I'm not saying, but in games it might be hard, right? When you're trying to innovate a lot, and then you can't get that. You can't get this like 30 seconds explanation. You need to.
It might damage your pride as a sort of an innovator. Okay, I can't sum this up in 30 seconds, but it's a useful thing to be able to do.
Yeah.
Sort of swallow your pride and go, yes, this game is like that one with a bit of that one. Yeah, might sort of hurt a bit to say it, but people will know what you're talking about.
Yeah. It's a good way to galvanize people around, like, I'll grab this community and that community and that community because I've referenced the things that they love and, without being Ready Player One or something.
I was about to say, you need
I didn't want to go there, but I did.
Very clever AI, Life 3.0 type kind of opening chapter where you've got an AI going around all the crowdfunding, successful campaigns, pulling all the elements in, and then constructing a crowdfunding campaign. That would be an amazing experiment to see how many people would actually back it. That's probably officially fraud.
AI development for that.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Cool. Speaking of budgets, which we nearly were, 91% of our... So remember that prevalent number that we had of very small studios between 2 and 5 people. 91% of those have a budget under 200k. So when you think about... We're talking about crowdfunding just now. A lot of the main concern you have when you do that is like, how much money do I ask for? What seems like a big budget when I'm asking for cash from people? So really do think about what you can actually do with that amount of money. We found that 42% of our top-ranked studios have a budget over 200k. And 23% of the top-ranked studios have a budget of over 500k. So, there is a lot of money taken to make a game. And, this might well be something that you think about being... how do I get hold of this money? I'm going to partially fund it with some of my own money. I'm going to get investors. I'm going to crowdfund this much. It might be that, the transparency that you have set in a crowdfunding scenario is something that people will value, that, we're going to take this much money from here, that from there. Because I think for me as a consumer, when I see something with a very, very low crowdfunding target, I'm like, I wonder how they're going to achieve that thing. I do want to help them by taking them over that target. I mean, Ciro, you did a crowdfunding thing.
And
not
I
to
made
kind
this
of
mistake. I will
dig deep.
openly say, like, I asked for too little. So because that was the idea, right? If you ask for less, then you're going to get there. And then maybe you will get more because people will, you will go over the amount that you ask for. But sometimes you don't, and then you end up with the money, which is very little, but you still have to make the game. So to your point, it makes sense to like ask for a realistic budget and not aim lower and hope for the best.
Yeah,
and I've joked with other seasoned developers. You'll see a crowdfunding pitch or similar, and they think they're going to get their game done in 6 months, and it's going to have this ton of features, and you just sort of chuckle to each other and go, "No, you're not. That's 5 years' work you've just laid out there." So either being very realistic about the scope of your game, or being realistic about how much money it's going to cost,
or both,
well, preferably both.
Yeah.
So, do you think with this kind of like spread of budgets, is that something? Because if you think about like the film industry, for example, the film industry are quite good at saying, this had a budget of this, and this was their block. This was their kind of like their take in the opening weekend, and this is how much it made overall. Do we do much of that in the games industry? It seems
I
like
think
a
we
very
ask for too little.
way.
We ask for too little. We forget that actually when you're asking for money, at the end of the day, most companies' overhead is on people. right? And you want to be able to pay people a wage in order for them to support their families, support their own life and whatever, and to be motivated in order to produce and develop the best product ever. It also means that you've got to pay for other overheads. If you do have a workspace, you've got to pay for the tools, you've got to pay for some of the licenses. There is just a reality, and I think, as long as you're not taking the piss, you can be quite transparent with people and say, yeah, this is how much it's going to cost, with a little bit of contingency. Certainly, a lot of the feedback that we've had when we've brought over investors from the West Coast of America to London as part of Games London, show them all the fantastic studios in the country, as part of what we do. But they will always say, you're all asking for too little. And that actually puts them a little bit on the back foot, because an investor or someone with money, whether it be, consumer, whatever, wants to be able to trust that you do know what you're talking about. So we shouldn't be ashamed. And maybe it's a particularly British thing, I don't know, but it doesn't seem to be. I always thought it was quite a British thing, but we shouldn't be ashamed. And there's also there's a big gap in the UK of VCs, for instance, or other investors who will invest anything between $500,000 and 3 million. So there's a big hole because the VCs and investors are only interested in the big budgets. So that's an interesting kind of space that these studios are occupying in, that actually, if you're looking for investment,
it's likely to be on the higher end.
Yeah, it's likely to be a higher end, so go higher.
So it's interesting. Like, how would you recommend people who are in that position, like these 10-person or less studios, how would you recommend they go about looking at how to budget and how to look for investors? Because it might not be immediately apparent. A lot of people who I know who make games, they communicate and they exist within the bubbles of the development side as opposed to the business side.
It's all through practice, isn't it, and learning and sharing. And we are a collaborative community as a games industry, and that's why going to industry events, listening to talks by people who've gone through that, who've made the mistakes, taking part wherever you can. If there is a sort of developer boot camps where you're getting sort of masterclasses from people like investors or people who have run a successful big company. So getting that experience of how to put together, or that knowledge of how to put together a business plan, how to do projections, how to do forecasting, all of that it sounds really boring, but it's so important because it professionalizes you. And again, in terms of the tax relief, if you're applying for your tax relief to government, you have to put together all of that anyway. But there are plenty of people who've been through it who can offer help. And it's not just necessarily a game-specific issue. So it is. We have expertise. We do have boot camps. We do have training courses. We do have finance marketplaces where you can be matched with people looking for money. But you've got to look out for those. Just always keep learning.
Yeah, and I think it's about as a creative person, being willing to kind of, understand the value of business people and how that fits into your creative process actually getting out there.
Yeah, and part of it is the way that you're able then to try and tell that story about this is why, in a really, really kind of transparent way. This is why it's going to cost this amount of money. This is where the budget is going.
Yeah.
And you mentioned contingency, and you can say a lot about that. And I've worked on games where we've had a slot in the schedule which we've marked as contingency, and secretly we all know exactly what we're going to be doing during that time, which means that by definition it is no longer contingency.
Yeah.
And there's nothing wrong with. There's nothing wrong, and indeed you should have a period in your schedule called contingency where it's your full expectation that you're not going to need it.
Yes.
And that's why it's called contingency.
Yeah.
If you're secretly going, I haven't got time to do this task, it's all right, I'll do it in contingency, you need to chop that out of the schedule at that point, and your amount of contingency has gone down a little bit.
You need to allocate more time.
Yeah, being honest firstly with yourself, but then also to any sort of stakeholders in your project about that.
Yeah. So speaking of budgeting, the last couple of points we have here, 10% of, so this is percentages left over after just paying salaries. 10% going to marketing, just under 20% allocated to software licensing. Thanks. and around 4% of budgeting going to training. Does that seem surprising? Like, I would expect more to be spent on marketing, but I guess not.
I'd expect more as well. On games I've worked on, it's always been a running joke that as much money was spent on marketing it as developing it,
right?
Which kind of stings a bit. But if that's the nature of the marketplace in which,
industry,
if that's the nature of the industry, then so be it.
Start on the top ranked studios, right?
Yeah, I was going to say that the top ranked studios spend 32% more on marketing,
and that makes total sense. That's why they're top ranked, right? and vice versa.
It's kind of a chicken and egg scenario, right?
And I mentioned earlier about the sort of classic mistake of a tiny indie studio might make a game, put it on the App Store, and expect it to sell just of its own merit because it's such an amazing game, but it fails because 100 other games were released that day. Yeah. That's what your marketing spends for.
But I also kind of wonder how people define marketing. I always have a real problem with these words sometimes because, marketing to me is community engagement. It is dev blogs. It is, all of this kind of stuff that is being in touch and being authentic, and that suddenly becomes a discipline that we sort of that's called influencer marketing. Well, in the old days it just used to be us on camera talking to ourselves. So I find it endlessly fascinating that people kind of assume, marketing is this thing over here, and actually we're all natural marketers. Well, not all natural marketers, but we are.
Anyone who can explain some value in the product.
Anyone who's been on a date has to be a marketer, for goodness sake. So it is. I think sometimes we kind of get scared of these words that we formalize into a sort of industry, whereas it is. There's so many aspects to what marketing means, and it kind of has to be knit through, I think the whole process.
So it's another one of those things, much like QA, that I think people think comes at the end of a production, but is actually much better done throughout the design process and throughout the production process.
On the topic of there sort of being vague boundaries, the figure on training, I think people are probably not including the evening they spend reading the documentation about some tool they're going to use. That's training. It's training yourself. Yeah. And I imagine most people would not have counted that in their budget on that figure.
Yes, it's true. Yeah.
And so many of the tools that we use in development, they're well documented. You can train yourself to use them. That's a good thing.
So that wraps up the kind of bulk of our study. Like I said, we're going to be doing this every year. So if you do have feedback for us, then please do reach out for us on Twitter. We're at Unity3D. You can speak to us. You can tweet me. I'm at Will Goldstone. Ciro?
At Ciro Continisio.
Cool.
Complicated.
Joe, how do people contact UKIE? How's the best way?
At UK_IE on Twitter, or at Octo.
Cool. Peter?
At Peter Pimley. I don't tweet much.
Cool. So just to kind of wrap up, we talked a lot about these new studios. Are there any particular point that you'd kind of grapple onto? Because there's a lot of negativity in some of the things that we discuss. It's challenging to put together a budget. It's challenging to come up with an idea and attract an audience. What do you think is one of the most important things around that? Because to me, it's about getting your idea out there as early as possible. What do you guys think?
If you run a game studio for a year or two and then have to wind up the business, at that point you're one of the most employable people in the industry. You've made all the mistakes. You know what not to do. I know people at work here that have run small indie studios, wound it up, and if you're able to view that as a success,
I don't regret all the things you said.
You've learned hundreds of things that I've never done that I don't know.
Yeah.
And
that's a good point. That's what I was saying. That's what I was saying before. That's what I said before when I said, "What do we define by success?" Right? Because some people see the end of the studio or even like game that doesn't sell much as like an utter failure.
But you have personal growth.
Yeah, have personal growth. Yeah, you have contacts that you made through the process. experience that you can recycle in games and in other industries, as we said before, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it's not beating yourself up or beating up other people either.
Mm-hmm.
And it is really hard work, but we're in this because it is so exciting, it's so innovative, it's so creative. You get to work on the most amazing things around the most amazing people. But let's nurture our community. Let's make sure that we are learning from mistakes and we are kind of understanding humans a bit more, understanding that we're basically teenagers as an industry in terms of our history. So we're going through quite a lot of growing pains and a little bit of hormonal strife. But it's important that we're the cutting edge and we're the world leading innovators in everything, and I mean that, and having that confidence and that resilience, which is what games in themselves teach us. They teach us perseverance and resilience because we fail in games all the time. So we're making our perfect kind of role models of how to be.
Let's celebrate.
That can be topped,
Yeah.
And let's celebrate that we have the tools now that if you have savings for a year, you've got a realistic. So it's something you could do.
Yeah.
Maybe 10 years ago, it would be impossible to make a video game with fewer than, say, 15 people.
Yeah. And I think with the kind of things that we're trying to do as Unity, we're trying to make our tool more appropriate for all of the different roles to work together more effectively. And I think everybody's doing that. We're doing that. Our competition's doing that as well because we're all recognizing the value
global trend,
collaboration. So thank you for joining us on this Fireside chat talking about the Game Studio report. As we've said before, we're doing this annually. And if you have feedback and want to hear different bits of data next year, then do reach out to us using some of the links below. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.